Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show. In this corner, weighing in at 176,000 tons, we have the Vekoma SLC suspended looping coaster. And in this corner, weighing in at a whopping 289,000 tons, the reigning champ, the B&M inverted coaster. Let's get ready to talk about it!
Now get ready, here we go.
Might as well have fun for every show, right? We got to do something interesting for every show. Got to figure something out like that. Okay, today's episode. Oh, wait. If you're your first time here, make sure you like and subscribe. Do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. All right, on today's episode, we're going to get right into it. This is going to be a left-right comparison. We're going to be comparing the classic B&M inverted roller coaster. This would be like a clone ride. Six Flags has the Batmans and stuff like that. So a ride like that to the classic SLC, the suspended looping coaster made by Vekoma. And we're going to go over some pretty big topics, and we're going to hit a little bit on each one, kind of lay it out left and right, and maybe we might come up with a winner. Not quite sure yet. We'll see what this match has. All right, first of all, let's start out with costs. Costs are always something really hard to deal with. Why is that? Because the way each park does their ride, they come up with a different cost every single time. For instance, if I were installing a ride, I want to know how much the entire thing is start to finish. So it's like, okay, my cost of my ride is going to be significantly higher compared to another park if they just consider it the cost of purchasing the ride from the manufacturer. I've talked about this before, but where I used to work, we purchased one of the early style floorless roller coasters from B&M. At the time, this was the number they published. It was nothing secret. At the time, the coaster came in right at about $16 million. That's what that coaster cost to purchase from the manufacturer. But the cost to actually get it installed on the ground, up and running, and actually open to the public added an extra $10 million on top of that, making it a $26 million roller coaster. So parks don't typically say this is what the whole thing cost us start to finish, because each one's different. The cost of my installation might be $1 million cheaper than another park's installation. So it's really hard to compare apples to apples on these things. But let's start with the SLC, the suspended looping coaster from Vekoma. It's a pretty set universal platform. It comes with a zero datum level across it, meaning all the footers are at the exact same height all the way across. It can be installed on a flat level piece of land with no modification. If you have a big hill in the middle of your land or you have a big dip in the middle of it, that means they have to modify the pillars, which is going to make your installation more expensive. The SLC comes in roughly, these are old numbers too, the SLC comes in at roughly $11 million turnkey from Vekoma. Now, the B&M, it is also a zero datum ride where it can be installed on flat level plane. Again, if you wanted terrain or anything else like there, that's going to be a lot of money, and that adds up really, really quick because the entire design has to be changed. But the B&M invert coaster typically came in, from my understanding, it came in right at about $13 million. So the two are really close to each other. And again, those are numbers that nobody likes to give out and nobody wants out either. So the numbers I have, take them with a very big grain of salt. I can't say, yes, this is it. And I guarantee you, if you called up both B&M and Vekoma, they would give you way different prices these days, because my numbers are pretty old. So I'm sure the price has drastically changed with the cost of steel and inflation and things like that. All right, let's talk about train capacity now. Each track, generally, is set up in a 4-block system, and each track houses 2 trains. So 2 trains per ride. So the B&M and the SLC come out dead even there. When it comes down to the trains themselves, The trains on the SLC are roughly 55 feet long, and the trains on the B&M are roughly 42 feet long. Now, the SLC having a longer train gives it more of an accordion effect as it goes through tighter inversions and stuff like that. That's when you're riding in the train, especially towards the front and the back, and you notice these slow down and speed up as the train goes through there. So the B&M comes in at 42 feet long, which means it's narrower by a little bit, almost a little over 10 feet actually. So it's able to accelerate and deaccelerate a little bit quicker through that stuff. Capacity-wise, the SLC holds 20 people. The B&M Invert holds on average 32 people. Both the SLC and the Invert can have the size of their trains modified, though. A lot of SLCs came out with a 7-coach train, meaning it only had 14 people capability. The B&M Inverts can actually lengthen or decrease the size of their train depending on the track and the way the manufacturer wants to run it, depending on what the park has to installation. So, on average, the B&M comes out ahead in this one because it can hold much more people and get the capacity per hour much higher than the SLC can. Let's talk restraints real quick. The SLC holds a ratcheting restraint. The B&M also holds a ratcheting restraint. What set the two apart from each other is that the SLC uses an electromechanical locking mechanism as opposed to the B&M only uses a mechanical latching mechanism. So what you get on that is that when you come back in on a B&M coaster, you'll see it slow down, and stop. And then you'll see the unlock platens come down and actuate the train. You'll see all those release mechanisms open all at the same time, and then the restraints open up. The restraints actually open via a gas cylinder on the inside, which produces that positive pressure that allows that actually very heavy horseshoe collar to actually come up with ease and maybe actually come up on its own. The SLC, on the other hand, also has mechanical ratchets that are double redundancy that allow it to lock on the way down, but it requires a electromechanical actuator. These things are called unipush actuators. The actuator has to extend out to close and lock the restraint, and it has to retract back in to unlock the restraint. Now, because of that, the SLC has to have power in the station, and when you're doing an evacuation on a lift hill, the B&M you simply just go through. You can use a crescent wrench and just hook it onto the side and open the restraints up. And the SLC, you actually need a 24-volt battery box to plug into each row one at a time to open up the restraints that way. So I think for ease of adjustment and everything else, the B&M restraint-wise comes out ahead over the SLC. The SLCs are a little more complicated. They have the electromechanical actuator is a very finite adjustment thing. You want to make sure that when it locks, it's not putting clamp pressure on the block assembly, and it's not actually pulling the teeth open either. So there's a lot of adjustment in those things. The B&Ms kind of, once you set the unlock cam height on them, that's it. You're done with those things. Check the cam height like once a month on them. It's not much. They rarely ever come out of adjustment unless something loosens up in the assembly. While we're talking about seats, let's talk about how the two are anchored onto the train. Okay, I'm not talking about the seat itself. I'm talking about the backbone that you sit on. That's the piece that actually comes down underneath the seat that you sit on and actually holds you to the coach itself. All right, let's start with the SLC. The SLC uses a steel backbone. For this, I'm going to say the original style SLC, the ones that I'm most familiar with, which it uses a one singular metal backbone that comes down, branches off into both seats on the left and the right, and then when those are put up into the main beam assembly up there, you have a giant pin, a round circular pin that goes through the center and basically pins that backbone to the housing, and then you have a safety bolt on the left and the right that actually prevent it from falling out. So that is how the SLC is anchored up in there, and then one of the byproducts of that is that two people on the same backbone get so much pressure forward and reverse from the elements and braking and stuff like that, is that it constantly gets hammered back and forth. Now that backbone pin has plates to keep it on both sides, but the housing itself is not supposed to crush the pin. It's supposed to just barely touch on both sides. So what happens in the SLC is that those bushings inside there, they're big brass bushings. Actually, they started a special, it was like a phenolic material, almost like a plastic. Those bushings would get hammered and they would start to wallow out on the inside. And then what that would do is that would produce a shake in the backbone. You could actually grab the backbone down to the seats and pull it real hard back and forth and actually get movement out of it. The more worn out that was, the more movement you would have, and it also produced a shakier ride out on the track. So not great for the SLCs. On the B&Ms, however, what those guys use is a solid steel backbone with four bolts mounted directly to the chassis overhead. So 4 bolts mounted there. It's also the same thing on an invert. It's pretty much the same 4 bolts down there. The 2 support columns look different. On a floorless coaster, it's more like just a square beam sticking up out of the chassis. On the invert coasters, it's more of a tapered beam that comes down to support the weight. Also inside that beam, closer towards the top, that's where the restraint unlock and lock mechanism has to hang out up there. So you need a little bit more space to put all that inside of there. Justifies the beam being a little bit wider. But as far as back-to-back motion, the hangers, the backbones on the B&M are mounted solid to the chassis. So there is no front to back and there's nothing side to side. Let's talk about side to side on those seats as well. The B&M, I just went over that. There's no side to side, they're solid mounted. The SLC, Vekoma tended to use 2 big shocks supporting the center beam. The shocks actually had no adjustment on them. They had to be put in. When we asked for clarification, because the manual didn't really stipulate how to put those shocks in, they said that the shocks should be put in neither under tension, neither under pre-tension or post-tension. So they weren't supposed to be pulling or pushing either way. They were supposed to leave the backbone essentially neutral sitting out there. Later on in the career, we got them to change that a little bit, not across for everybody's, but they allowed us to basically pre-tension those a little bit. So once we put them in and put the bolts in on both sides, we were actually able to tighten the shock and basically pull it up. And I believe that helped out that main bushing in the center from getting so hammered up, but that was a neat thing. As far as those shocks, once you're out on the track, they did allow the backbones slightly to sway from side to side, but it wasn't much at all. But they did allow that to some extent. Didn't improve the overall ride, I feel, though. It was something that sounded good on paper, didn't actually do anything in real life. All right, so let's move on to chain dogs and anti-rollbacks. Chain dogs and anti-rollbacks. On the B&M, it used 2 chain dogs. One was around coach number 2, and the other one was around coach 4, I believe it was. And then on the SLC, it also used 2 chain dogs. One was in coach number 5, and one was in coach number 7. More towards the middle of the train on the SLC, but still 2 chain dogs. So 2 and 2, they're dead even. No big deal there. They're both steel chain dogs that are spring loaded up so that when you push down on them, they just spring right back up into place. Nothing too fancy there. It's the exact same B&M style for the anti-rollbacks as well, because the chain dogs also held an anti-rollback right next to them, and then every other coach was also an anti-rollback. Nothing's on coach number 1 because that's the pilot coach assembly. While we're on the subject of pilots, for the B&M coasters on the inverts, the pilot coach assembly is typically in the front of the train, and the SLC, the pilot is, well, it's not called a pilot there, it's just a tail. The tail is on the back of the train. Now, B&Ms do theirs a little bit differently, to where that the coach that is the pilot is the one that you sit on. So there's no wasted space there. The train is, let's say, 8 coaches long. So coach 1 is the pilot, and coach 2 is the secondary, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 all have seats. The way the SLC works is that coach number 1 is a secondary coach, and that goes all the way back through coach number 10. But then there is a tail on the back of the train. So you'd have 10 coaches you could sit on a 10-coach long train. And then there would be this weird 11th coach back there that doesn't have seats hanging from it. It just kind of sits back there. That's the tail coach. So what B&M did is that tail, they put it up front. And it's the same thing Intamin did. They put theirs up front. But B&M actually put seats on it and got rid of the lone thing by itself. Intamin's actually leave theirs blank, just like the Vekomas. They leave a blank coach out there for the tail. So while we're talking about chain dogs and anti-rollbacks, let's talk about what they bite into and head into the track and structure. I still have more on the train, but let's get into the track and structure just for a hair. Both the B&M Invert and the SLC both use a standard steel chain to actually pull the train up to the top of the lift hill. So they are both dead even on that. The B&M Invert uses a cam and lobe system going up the lift hill. So that are those anti-rollbacks clicking down, and then that allows, they go up against a cam on the track that they ride. That makes a clack, clack, clack sound as it goes up there. Most of them do have urethane pads on there, so it kind of makes like a thud sound, so they're not so loud anymore. The SLC, on the other hand, uses a rail and cam system. So I've gone over this in my anti-rollback video, so I won't spend too much time on it. But basically, they use a centerline fin sticking down from the track, and then
no ending! No ending! No ending!
Yeah, you know it's time to make videos when people start mowing their lawn, right? All right. They use a fin sticking down from the track, and then 2 cams as they come along the train. The cams will open up and allow that fin to come through, and then when you try to roll the train backwards, they essentially bite into that. Did I go over that on the SLC? The SLC has 3 anti-rollback cams on it. The B&M has 4 anti-rollbacks. The SLC has 3 anti-rollback cams on it. So the B&M has a little bit more anti-rollback than the SLC does. But the interesting part about the SLC is that it's much quieter typically going up the lift hill because it doesn't have that rhythmic thudding that the B&M does. So the B&M kind of actually gets knocked down a little bit for the audio level going up the lift hill, as opposed to the SLC a little bit more on the quiet side of things. So that's a plus for that one. Let's stay on track and structure while we're talking about the lift hill real quick. Let's talk about it. The SLC uses a very large DC motor at the very top of the lift hill through a planetary drive gearbox to turn its chain. That's how it gets you to the top of that ride. On the other side, the B&M ride uses a very large DC motor at the bottom of the lift hill through a giant reduction gearbox on the side. So gearboxes, planetary, the 90 degree, I'm going to call that a wash. DC motors are a wash. It boils down to the mounting location. I'd much rather have equipment down low and easy to work on than up high. The other thing that gets knocked down in this category is that they both make a lot of noise. Give you that. But the B&M Invert makes its noise down low, closer to the ground, and it's easier to absorb that sound closer to the ground. Once you take that SLC and put it up high, they've given it a stainless steel, what they call a doghouse up there. The doghouse covers the motor. It's really there to protect it from the elements, to keep rain and things like that off of that motor, because you don't want those motors exposed to that. But one of the things they try to do is control the sound with that doghouse. But those motors are quite loud, and hundreds of feet off the ground, they project their noise all over the park. So although the SLC has a quieter anti-rollback system on the lift, its lift in general is noisier than the B&M Invert, so it gets knocked down in that category. Okay, kind of off that tangent, sorry about that. Let's go back to the trains and continue to talk about the trains. Let's start with the suspension of the train. Okay, on a B&M inverted roller coaster, there essentially is no suspension on that train. That is all metal-to-metal components that hold everything in regards to the wheel carrier, to the chassis, to the seats. So that is what we consider like it's a solid ride. There's nothing in there to really absorb that. Later revisions of stuff, I know I've seen this on dive coasters and some of the other things, that they did start making a suspension system to some of these things to help absorb some of the vibrations out there. But for these earlier inverts that I know of for sure, and the majority of inverts out there, they do not have a suspension to them on the B&Ms. Flip corners, and we're going to talk about the SLC. The SLC actually does have a suspension to it. On top of the big shocks that hold the backbone and let you swing a little bit from side to side, as the wheel carrier comes into the main axle housing, inside the main axle housing where the wheel carrier is allowed to rotate on its side, inside that main axle housing there is a set of 4. They look like a rubber puck. It looks like imagine a rubber donut, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top, that's compressed inside that housing. Those are called, they call them elastosprings. The suspension is the 4 elastosprings. That allows that housing to move independently and lets the wheel carrier kind of jump up and down as it's needed. It's a cool idea. Do we need more suspension on a ride? Surprisingly enough, a lot of manufacturers build suspension for their rides. I know RMCs have full suspension on them. Great Coasters have suspension on them, and a couple other ones out there. But they do have suspension in there to actually let the assemblies move and helps absorb the vibration. But for the SLC, don't really think it's needed. Then again, haven't ridden one without it. That might be a whole different scenario once you take that suspension out of there. But the manufacturer thought it was necessary when they built it, so they put a suspension system into the SLC. Let's move from the main axle housing and go out into the wheel carrier assembly. The first thing we're going to talk about is the wheel carrier pivots. Okay, so when the track changes direction and it goes up and it goes down, the wheel carrier has to pivot to allow that to change angles. So on an SLC, the wheel carrier has 5 wheels on it, and it pivots in the center, basically right behind where the rail is. So if you can imagine the wheel carrier, it's like this, and the rail is right in front of it like that, the wheel carrier pivots dead center right behind it to allow for as the rail goes up, as the rail comes down. The B&Ms, however, they pivot at the bottom underneath, not just underneath the wheel carrier, underneath the upstop wheels, further down below that. So they pivot on a giant pin underneath there. So where the SLC's wheel carrier would pivot in the center right here and pivot around like this, the B&M's wheel carrier actually has a pivot down here, which means that the wheel carrier actually pivots like this. It pivots in an arc. Now, one thing that does do is it puts your motion further away. So this assembly is actually a little more susceptible to rattling. So it can shake a little bit more as the B&Ms go along. The wear in the slewing ring is one of the things I was talking about on a different video, which is where I think a lot of the B&M shake is coming from. It's in the slewing ring. But the slewing ring is actually on the wheel carrier. It's below that pivot. The slewing ring's even further down. So the further away from the rail you get and loosen tolerance up, the more all that stuff is just allowed to shake itself apart up there. So I'm actually going to go with the SLC on this one. I like that centralized pivot behind it. I feel it's a much stabler component to put out into the track. Okay, so talking about wheel carriers now. The difference between a B&M and an SLC wheel carrier. All right, B&M wheel carriers use 6 wheels. SLCs use 5 wheels. Where do we lose a wheel? Both wheel carriers have 2 road wheels, so the wheels that ride on top of the rail, they take all the load as it goes around. The term is, yes, universal. They could be called load wheels. They could be called road wheels. Kind of the same thing. So B&M uses 2 road wheels, That's how I refer to them as. It uses 2 guide wheels to keep the train moving left and right, and then it uses 2 upstop wheels against the bottom of the track. Now, the SLC uses 2 road wheels, 2 guide wheels, but it only uses 1 upstop wheel. Now, this is actually a really big problem for the SLC, and I'll tell you why. Because when you take a piece of pipe and you bend it, you have 2 tangents that it's going to hit on. It's got 2 points. There's a point here and a point here, and then an arc in the center. Well, when you go up, the arc goes down. It looks like a U. So you have your road wheel, and then your upstop wheel is theoretically touching there as you're curving up. That's great. When that has to go down the opposite way, and there's not too much, it's like, well, go over the drop. There's really not much need to go down. But you think about it, sometimes if you twist one direction, like going into a corkscrew, you take that rail and you turn it down, and then that arc goes the other way to where I have a road wheel, and then a big space between the upstop. Now, the upstop is not spring-loaded on the SLC. It has an air gap underneath there. That means when you go in the morning time and inspect it, what we used to do is go along, and the manufacturer said it had to be a 2mm gap underneath that upstop wheel. So between the rail and the upstop, there needed to be, I took an Allen wrench, 2mm Allen wrench, and slid it between the wheel and the rail, right in there, and that was my 2mm gap. That's what it was supposed to be. The B&Ms don't have that measurement because their wheels are spring-loaded. Guides, upstops are both spring-loaded. Now, B&Ms don't have, the spring loading is not there to keep it tight against the track. It's there to keep the wheel turning. It's to prevent the wheel from stopping turning so that it gives you dead spots while it's out rolling around. So it's not like on a B&M, the springs for the guides and upstop is actually part of the suspension, or they make up part of the comfort to the ride. They're actually very easy to overcome. You can simply grab an upstop wheel and with about 8 pounds of force, just pull it away from the track. That means 16 pounds of force total to do both. 16 pounds of force on a train that weighs that much is not doing anything. So that is just there to keep the wheels touching the track. So let's talk about guide wheels now. On the SLC, the guide wheels are eccentric on an axle from the top. And that means just like the upstop wheels, those guide wheels have an air gap behind them. On ours, we set the air gap at 4mm. That's what the air gap had to be. That air gap changes depending on your wheel compound and how your track is made. We actually had to gauge ours to the narrowest part of the track, which was, interestingly enough, it was the last bend coming out of the second reduction brake as it goes into the station. That was the narrowest part right there. If we got them too wide as it went around that corner, we tried it a couple times. As it went around that corner, it would actually peel paint off the rails. It would crush into it so hard. So I was like, we ran it for a little while, but realistically, it started delaminating guide wheels. So I was like, we couldn't do that. We had to back them back off to 4mm to let them work properly. Now, the B&M has no air gap whatsoever in there. They're touching the sides of the rails the entire time. So that's hard to judge. But when you put the vehicle on the transfer table and grab the guide wheels and pull back on them, there's about a 2 or 3mm gap that opens up. So I'm going to call that pretty even across the two, because they both have a gap there. Just one spring-loaded where you can't see it. The other one is sitting out in the open air. When it comes to turning the vehicle around a left-hand set of rails, around a right-hand turn or something like that, when it comes to turning the vehicle, they operate in 2 different ways. So first, the SLC has a main axle housing, which those wheel carriers are mounted to the suspension inside of that axle housing. That axle housing is very stiff if you think about it. If I make myself the axle housing and I have wheel carriers out to the edges of my shoulders here, the way I turn is once a guide wheel hits the rail, path of least resistance, I am going to back up there. So literally I have to turn like this. the whole axle housing from the center turns from side to side, and that's how it goes around there. The B&M Invert, however, it does not have that problem. It's solid. In fact, that housing can't turn side to side. It's the whole chassis. It can't turn side to side like that. So what they did is they used those big Roth bearings underneath there. I call them Roth bearings. That's just a manufacturer. They've probably changed them since then. But they used large slewing rings underneath those wheel carriers that now allow the wheel carriers to turn independently of what they need to do. That means if the radius is super tight going around a corner and one wheel carrier needs to turn 20 degrees and the other wheel carrier only needed to turn 19 degrees, that they can do that because they weren't bound together with each other. So that meant the tolerance had to be a little more precise to keep those from shaking. Again, back to my video of the B&M shake, I think that is one of the major problems with that, because those slewing rings I feel like are the problem, and that's allowing them to hunt while the train's out on the track. Again, I've said it before, hunting is when the train basically goes to the left side of the rail and hits it and bounces off, and then goes to the right rail and hits it and then bounces off again. Hunting is much more predominant for the SLC because of its loose guide wheel tolerances. The B&M has a much tighter guide wheel tolerance to start with, so it can hunt, but it does it very minimalistically because the wheel carriers are independent and they just will naturally find their center as it goes along. With the main axle housing on the SLC, and I turn the shoulders and I bounce off the right rail and then go, oh, I'm going this way now, that's it. I'm going that way until I hit the left-hand rail, and then I go, oop, okay, back the other way. Now, that's not as predominant as you would think it would be because there's not that many sections of just flat, straight track going through. And when you are going through straight track, most of the time you're in a brake run, which the brakes will center the train and kind of hold it dead center anyway. You're not really going to feel that. So that is guide, up, stop, and turning for the SLC to the B&M. I feel like in all those categories, the B&M comes out ahead on there just because it's got a much tighter tolerance. I don't like the loose tolerances the SLCs have because it does allow for more hunting, more play, more everything else. Okay, into track and structure. Let's talk about the brakes. B&M typically uses their same exact brake that they use on pretty much everything, which is a giant set of brass skis out there, which are spring-loaded in the closed position. You need air to open those brakes back up. They have a tremendous amount of stopping power. Those springs are really wound up tight inside of there. They're great. I don't really have any problems with the B&M brakes. Nothing at all. The SLC uses they're called, what is it? It's their Windjammer L4 series brake was the one that we had on there. They are linear pinch brakes. They're these guys. They look just like old aero brakes because they all came from the same place. These are pneumatically applied spring release, just like these. And if I take this and the real ones do that exact same thing. You can close them by hand and they will spring right back open. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Everyone contacts me and says, oh man, I can't believe they would put basically fail open brakes in there. Vekoma builds a safety system for every single brake. So when you look at a row of 10 brakes, there's actually 10 safety systems working it. So it is the exact same thing as one of your mechanical B&M brakes, because you could say, well, you could have the air valve on the inside leak and it bypasses your brake. Same thing, you could blow a hose to this and it bypasses your brake. It's like, okay, is there redundancy to them? Yeah, these have a air tank up above that it makes a complete redundant system for the ride. The B&Ms have a second spring. Instead of just one cylinder open and closing the brake, they have two of them right next to each other. In case you break one of them, the other one takes care of it and it does its job as well. So every time I get one of those comments like, I can't believe they would put a fail open brake on there, I always have to say, I've never heard of one of these brakes failing like the system failed while the ride was running. I've never heard of that before. We did a 20-minute bleed down test on these, which is where we opened up and evacuated all the air out of the system right up until those emergency tanks. And the check valves and stuff had to hold these brake closed for 20 minutes with no air in the system. Typically passed every month with flying colors. I mean, unless you had something up there just going, then it's like, that one's going to fail the bleed down test. But in that case, the ride can't open that day anyway until that air leak is fixed. That's not a great thing. So I've never had a problem with these brakes, but the other thing that they are is they're kind of labor intensive on the back side here. These chatter blocks back here that actually take the force, and then these little tabs right here that allow the brake to basically hang inverted like this. These tabs wear down like crazy on there, and the chatter blocks need a lot of adjustment. So that takes that one lone thing right there is what takes the SLC brakes down and lets the B&M brakes go ahead of them. That's it. Just lots of little parts that need adjustment on those. Other than that, I would call those the same brake. But because of the ease of braking and the ease of working on them, I would say the B&M comes out ahead in the braking department. Okay, last one is track and structure. The track itself. So for the track, there are obviously two different styles. The B&M is it's where the center is occupied, which means it's got your rail, and then there's a tie between the two. And the Vekomas, the SLC, uses where the center is open. The train actually rides in the center, and for that, they've had to build a structure that went from the main beam on top or the backbone on top and actually come around, go down, and then back underneath to hold the rails on there. Now, the SLC, that whole assembly is prone to tolerancing issues. Over time, the train can continue to hammer one side, and then over the years, it will eventually push those rails a little bit further away. It's not much. It's not much. It's a millimeter or maybe two over 20 plus years of service on it in very high stress areas. So it's really not much. Not even something like you need to go out and fix. So the B&M tracks, they don't have anything to wander around. The rail dimensions can't change. That never changes. It's always locked into place. It can't get wider. It can't get narrower unless they built it that way. That's it. That's the only time. So the old Arrow / Vekomas that have those big arms to the outside of their rails, those can sit there and do this number while the train's running around, which would cause things like, okay, you need to go out there and move those back into tolerance. I never found any that were out of tolerance. When we had a company come in, let's see, I think that was back in 2012 or 2013, we had a company come in and we actually opted to have some of the track massaged for the SLC, and they did a lot of work to it. And honestly, when they were done with it and they said, oh, we pulled it in 2 millimeters on this side, we fixed this, we did that, we did all these things to it. And I believe this was with Vekoma's oversight when they did it. Honestly, I didn't feel much difference on the ride. The accelerometer said there was a difference, but I didn't personally feel a lot of difference. And I took care of that ride for a long time, so I wasn't impressed with the amount of money it took to do that process and the outcome that we got from it. Wasn't impressed at all. So I don't feel that was a big thing. But for the track, I'd say your B&M comes ahead because of the fact that they don't have those big outer ties on there. Now, newer rides, newer SLCs that, away from that original SLC model, I'm talking like a family inverted coaster that Vekoma now builds. Yes, they're the exact same thing as the B&M. They've got the ties between them and the wheel carriers ride to the outside now. That's a big thing, and that's great for them. It makes a wider, more stable base, just like the B&M had. It's a wider, stabler base, so they're able to make the ride a little bit more stable as it goes around there. But there was still one thing on the SLC that I honed in on that I've never experienced with the B&M, and that was the actual rails themselves, the round rail that's welded onto the track, or that is the track, I should say. So on the B&M, we never had any guide problems, upstop problems, or anything like that where we had to look at that rail for some reason. But on the SLC, because it operated off of all air gaps, it needed a 2mm air gap, it needed a 4mm air gap on the guides and 2 on the upstops. My question became, why? Why does it need that? Why would you need something like that? I don't understand. It's a round rail. Why would I need an air gap with a round rail? So that's when I came up with, well, if the track turns this way, it gets bigger on the bottom, if it goes this way, and the ride does a lot of pulling up like that. So I was like, okay, that must be it. That must be the thing. But when we started checking gauge and actually measuring all over the place, and we found our crushed corner on the side there where the gauge was really narrow, it's like, okay, there's a gauge issue right here from the manufacturer, as far as I could tell anyway. So it's like the gauge is really tight right here. Maybe we can fix that, and then we could fix our guide wheel spacing. Well, one of the things we found out is that the rails weren't round around the corners. And that was interesting because I was sitting there looking up at the brakes and stuff, doing inspections, and I noticed that, you know, where the road wheels go, you'll see like a relief in the paint, a cut in the paint where the wheels have always been running. It's just pretty much bare steel. Same thing where the guide wheels are. Where the guide wheels run, it looks like a stripe that runs along the side because it's worn the paint off the thing. Well, on the SLC, the upstops don't produce that because there's an air gap. The upstop where it would go on the track typically just looks like a paint job. There's no paint missing. So I was looking at where the brakes were, and there's no paint missing, except for around the corner. There's paint missing where the upstops were. And I was like, I wonder why that is. So I went up there and started measuring and checking the rail to see how round it was. And what we found out is that, kind of in general across the ride, what we found out is that when they took the rail and they bent it hard to the right, that round rail became an oval. And it got really tall as it bent that way. Because the way you bend steel is between 3 wheels. 2 wheels that move it forward and a third one in the center that pushes. And then as you put more pressure on that triangle, it slowly starts to radius the rail. So when they put those big turns in there, those really tight turns, that rail was actually 3 or 4 millimeters taller than it was in the straight section. And the same fact that when it was curved up, that rail was a couple millimeters thinner when it was going high, really curving up fast or going down fast. And I was like, that's interesting. We checked on the B&M to see if we could find that, and we couldn't really find it. So if it was there, it was minimal. It definitely wasn't measurable like it was on the SLC. So all I could think of is that when you roll rails out, if you use it between 2 rollers, you'll crush the rail. And then you talk with an exhaust shop that bends tubing for a living, and they'll tell you that's a crush. Yeah, we have their special charts to adjust for how much the tubing expands and contracts when we crush the tubing for a car. It's the same thing on a ride, but if you use these special rollers that have these really, it looks like a half C, and it's like a mandrel style roller. As it crushes the tube, it doesn't allow the tube to swedge out like that. It kind of keeps it in that shape. Rollers are much more expensive and stuff to do for that, but that's more of a mandrel style rolling assembly, and it keeps those tubes very similar size shape the entire time. So I'm guessing, just a guess, that Vekoma is probably now doing mandrel rolling for all of their stuff now, and that's kind of a thing in the past. But we're talking about older roller coasters here, so I think that's where the B&M also comes ahead, is that they did a semi-mandrel process putting their track together, and the Vekoma did not. But after you get all these things out, what do you get? The main difference between the two is the price tag. It's like, the Vekoma is definitely a cheaper ride. It's cheaper to purchase, it's cheaper to install than the B&M is. The The B&M, they don't give you everything you need with that ride. You have to buy a lot of stuff afterwards. So a lot of the air tanks and things like that, that's all in the contract as supplied by others. The SLC, there is a lot of supplied by other stuff in there, but those safety tanks for the brake assemblies and stuff like that I was talking about, that stuff is pretty much included with the ride. So a little more upfront equipment that you get when you purchase the SLC. Let's talk about convenience of maintenance now. It's my last subject, I believe. The convenience of maintenance. So on the SLC, they do take a fair amount of time to keep up and running. There is a lot of pivots, a lot of pins, a lot of things to grease, and they wear down. Definitely during the rehab, there is a lot of bushings that have to be replaced. A bushing is just a piece of metal. It's round. It's been rolled around in a circle typically and put in there to allow a pin to sit inside. You use a bushing inside of a bore so that when the pin wears out, you don't wear the bore out. You simply just replace that bushing and the bore is like brand new again. Same thing with like engine bearings and things like that. You use bearings that are replaceable so you don't wear the bore out inside the block. So there is that with the SLCs. They typically chew up more maintenance time. They chew up more inspection time as well because of all those components. Everything in the brake assembly up here, having to get up there with a man lift and check all this stuff every single day, adds more time, which is more operating cost to it. The B&M, they're definitely more expensive to maintain because their parts cost a lot more money, but you get that money back in inspection time. They're much quicker to inspect, and they don't have as many things go wrong with them that you would think that a lot of other rides do. Consumables, both rides go through booster wheels. Booster wheels, a lot of booster wheels. And those are the rubber wheels that drive the train forward in and out of the station, transfer tracks and stuff like that. So both rides go through their fair amount of booster wheels. That's about even with it. Operating costs, I feel like your consumables are higher for the SLC, but that's kind of matched with the lower consumables of the B&M, but they're higher cost. Does that make sense? In the SLC, you might need $125,000 to refurbish a train for the off-season, but the B&M, you can also do that exact same job, but you're hardly replacing anything, but the stuff you are replacing is pretty flippin' expensive. But you kind of get what you pay for on those things. Okay, so overall, I feel like, I know it's a big shock for a lot of people, I feel like the B&M came out ahead here once you started putting things side by side and saying, what's this, what's that, how are we going to, almost every category, the B&M came out ahead. And in the other categories, like I like the wheel carrier turning in the center, it's like, well, that goes back to the track styles for the SLC. That's why they're allowed to be in the center. The B&Ms, they have the ties between the tracks, so they can't be on the interior side, they have to be on the exterior side, and then you'd be making the train super wide trying to get center pivots in there. Not worth its while at all. But I feel like the B&M came out ahead. Let me know if you have any different thoughts on that, because sure, I'd like to hear. Let's think about that. I don't do many comparison videos. In fact, I think this is my first one, so let me know what you thought about it too. Like, subscribe, do all that stuff downstairs. It does help me out. I do appreciate it. If you want to contact me, you can always just message down below. Perfectly fine. If you don't want to say something down below, perfectly fine with that too. I have an email, which is ryantheridemechanic@yahoo.com. And as always, stay off the air gates. Bye.